So in this video we're going to take a look at how to use QRemesher to rebuild the topology on this figure that you see here. So you can see that it's actually, if I step up the subdivision levels, it's quite a bit of sculpted detail. There's several subdivision levels, quite a bit of sculpting here, but the underlying topology is just not suitable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Freeze Subdivision Levels, and that's going to store all those higher subdivision levels in memory, and then press the Q, B for brush, Q for QRemesher, to create the QRemesher brush here. And this allows me to just start drawing guide curves on the model. And I'll draw these curves to follow the edge flow that I want the edges to conform to. And the X symmetry is on this, so I actually don't need to continue around to the opposite side. It will mirror across. So you see how the mouth loop and the eye loop there were asymmetrical. It's fine, it won't pay attention, it will just mirror them across. So I'm just creating some very basic guide curves here. I don't want to be too specific because QRemesher works best when you just give ZBrush suggestions on how to lay out the curves. For example, here I'm drawing loops around the fingers by holding down Shift and then clicking and dragging, and that snaps a loop around the volume. So by putting one at the base and the tip of each finger, ZBrush then has a guide that lets it know, okay, you need to make sure that you get the whole volume of these fingers. The important thing is to just guide the plugin on where to lay out curves. It's going to follow your guides as best as it can, as well as respecting the polygon count that you specify. So it's going to create a balance between the two. You need to think of it much in the same way that we think about UV Master. It is an automatic UV mapping tool, but it gives you human-readable UVs and a certain amount of control. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on Auto Mask and then click QRemesher under the Tool Geometry menu, and it will process and then create a new underlying base mesh that is derived from those guide curves that we drew. Now those guide curves again are going to help flow the topology. It's going to help guide the plugin on where to place the edge loops. There you can see the edge flow conforms pretty closely to the guide curves that I laid down. Now we have lost our upper subdivision levels, so the way we take care of that we'll look at in a moment. We just unfreeze those subdivision levels. So this is a much better base mesh, but we need to get our sculpting back. So I click Freeze Subdivision Levels again. It says up there that it's subdividing geometry, and you'll see that it's actually going to process now. It's going to reintroduce all of that sculpted detail, but it's going to do it on top of this base mesh. So it's going to allow us to completely rebuild our topology while retaining all of our sculpted detail, which is really a fantastic tool. So now it's finished processing, and you can see it pops up to the highest subdivision level and then masks the mesh. So if there's any areas that need to be smoothed out that were not projected, you can deal with those. That would happen if you were to have added new appendages or things coming off of the mesh. Those would be unmasked, and then you could sculpt those without affecting what was previously sculpted. So here you can see we've got all of our subdivision levels intact, all of our sculpting intact, on top of the original base, or the new topology. So we've completely rebuilt this mesh from the ground up, but maintained all of our sculpting. So now we'll be able to take this character and then reshape it into a completely different humanoid form for our razor blade angel. So in this video we're going to take a look at creating a negative space cut through this figure, which has sculpted detail already in place and multiple subdivision levels. I'll click Freeze Subdivision Levels, and the first thing we want to do is define a mask. We're going to paint a masked area, which will allow us to polygroup where we want our hole to be cut. We're going to be using a mesh insert brush, and the mesh insert brush needs two things to cut a hole. It needs to have a polygroup that it's being applied to, and it needs to have holes in it itself. The mesh insert brushes you've seen probably in some of my other videos. We use them a lot in this tutorial. The mesh insert brushes allow you to actually add meshes to your Z-tool and have them topologically contiguous. But to do that they need to have holes in them. They have to have a hole. That hole tells ZBrush where to attach the existing faces and where to blend the topology. So first off, we're making a masked area. And this masked area we will use to create a polygroup. So I'm just going in using the mask lasso and just cleaning up this area. Now once I've got this area defined, I'm just going to go to Tool, Masking, and I'll click, I'll go to Tool, Polygroups, and click Group Masked. So that will mask or group the masked area. As you can see there, it's now the yellow polygroup. So after I save my work, I'm going to open the Cylinder 3D tool under the Tool menu. The Cylinder 3D tool is just a ZBrush primitive. You can see it's right there, and I immediately turn it into a poly mesh. And now using the visibility marquee, the selection marquee, I'm going to hide the end caps. So it's basically a hollow tube now. And I'll go to Brush, Create Insert Mesh, and then click New. Now that's created a new cylinder insert mesh brush. And it looks like it disappeared right now because backface culling is off, so you can see through the interior faces. And it's facing at the camera. It's not actually disappeared. I'm just saving that brush, which is available for you to use. There, I'm moving it around so you can see it. If I turn on double-sided, it's much easier to see now. So I'm going to use this to insert a hollow cylinder. So I hold down the Alt key, click and drag, and what that does is it draws that cylinder inserted into the mesh. It masks out the rest of the body and then leaves the cylinder unmasked. So I'm using the Move brush now to shift that cylinder around. There you can see I'm shifting it around to create a channel that goes through that polygroup. What ZBrush is going to do, it's going to take that polygroup and it's going to take those edges inside that polygroup and then try and conform them to the edges of that cylinder that are flowing through, maintaining all quad topology and basically carving a hole in right through this figure, which is really hard to do in previous versions of ZBrush, especially if you want to maintain your subdivision levels. So I'm just trying to get a general shape of the hole. I don't have to be too specific because I'm going to use the Move brush on it later. And then I just clear the mask and then Control, click and drag a second time, and it executes. And you can see here how it's carved that hole out. It's now created continuous edges that follow all the way through that hole. And it's polygrouped. The original polygroup, the transitional edges, and then the cylinder as it passes through. So that is how we use a mesh insert brush to carve a negative space out right through our figure. So now that we've successfully executed the hole creation, we're going to unfreeze the subdivision levels by clicking the button again. ZBrush will process and then reintroduce all of our subdivision levels with the sculpted geometry while retaining the new geometry of that negative space that we've carved through. And this is going to take a little bit of time, so I'm going to edit the video here just so you can see it without having to sit through the whole process. So here we go. You can see that it masks out everything but the new geometry. And there's a little bit of an overlap there, so that's good. The fact that it's unmasked allows us to go and clean up the edges and smooth it away without damaging what was our original sculpture that we had frozen earlier. So we can just use the smooth brush to smooth that back and clean it up. So this allows us an immense amount of control over the shape of our meshes throughout the entire process. As you can see from this workflow, you can go and cut and add new geometry at any point in the sculpture, which previously has been really difficult, if not impossible, to do. It certainly doesn't take place as quickly and easily as this insert mesh and freeze subdivision level process allows. So here I'm just going through and smoothing out the edges and clearing the mask just to get ready to go in and do some more detailing. So I'm just going to use the Move brush to go in and shape the hole into something a little bit more interesting in terms of shape, language, and design. I want to give it the feeling of being an orifice, a fleshy orifice carved through this body, because we are going to have a human heart suspended in the center. So I want it to all have a very meaty, very biological, and very fleshy feel to it. So I'm just going through with the Move brush and just adjusting the shapes. And it's just freehand sculpting right now. And I also want to widen the ribcage a little bit. I feel like it would really benefit from being a larger hole to more effectively frame the heart. And I'm also doing something a little bit cheeky here. I'm adding a heart shape into the hole. So I'm adding the icon of the heart into the hole in which you're going to see the actual human heart. It's a little subtlety. Some people pick up on it in the final piece and some people don't. It's almost like just a little visual pun. And I will much further detail the edges on here using the inflate brush and the standard brush later on, but right now I'm only interested in getting the shape, getting the overall form that I'm looking for. Now that we've got this hole carved away for the heart, we're going to take a look in the next video on how we can actually create the heart itself. And to do that, we're going to bring in a reference image of the heart in a way that hasn't been possible before. We're going to use the grid, the floor grid, as an actual image plane in ZBrush, which is really nice because it's going to allow us to keep our model and our photo reference permanently locked together in orientation while we work.